Hey, this is Detroit Bob. They tell me I need to up my style game, so here I am. So you're going to see a little before and after. If this doesn't get me into the vinyl shops and get me some good 45s, nothing will. Hey, Detroit Bob back at you. I think this is going to do it. I'm all ready for today's podcast. I'm feeling transformed, and I think I'm ready to rock and roll. So tune in, listen to the podcast, and you might even meet Johnny. So here we go. Hey, this is Detroit Bob. Here we are at our first Detroit Bob podcast. And what is that going to be? Well, we're going to talk about, most of all, vinyl records, specifically 45s. And that's a 45 RPM. Tends to have the larger hole, and they're about 7 inches big. Now, that's a niche within a niche, right? Vinyl is huge. It's actually bigger than CDs now. So we need to talk about them. We need to know how to buy them, how to find them, how to collect them, how to save them in your digital storage and your digital databases. And we're going to start that right now. Now this will end up on RockMine, all one word, searchable on YouTube, or Detroit Bob, all one word, searchable on YouTube. So what you can do is look that up. Now, when you do that, you're going to want to subscribe. And it's one thing to like something, but when you subscribe, it's going to be a little bookmark on the side of your YouTube page that helps you find the show. And this show will be the long format. We'll do interviews. We'll sometimes talk in depth about things that we don't get time to do in the regular weekly RockMine episode, which airs every Friday at 12 noon. So these will air about every 3 weeks, and we're going to get into it right here. I got a podcast room. I got a hot cup of coffee. So join me for some fun. So first of all, how did I get into this, and how did podcasting even end up on my radar? Well, one thing is for sure, you sort of stumble in things where you get into that last chapter of your life, or your last third, or sometimes it's called the third act. Some guys take up golf. Other guys are metal detecting. Other guys, like myself, start doing all three. And vinyl is 1/3 of the piece of picture of my life. I like to travel, but I also like vinyl, and I like music. So finding old records in what I call gems in thrift stores, antique stores, record stores is something I've been doing my whole life. And I basically started listening to 45s when I was about 5 or 6. First time I ever listened to a 45, I think it was Tommy Roe, Dizzy. And I remember being on my hobby horse and just going crazy. And I loved that little syncopated drum beat. And it just seemed to really pop off the turntable. I didn't know it. I knew it just sounded good. And my sisters used to play 45s. I think we had a little RCA one-speaker, what I would call a portable record player. It was dark green with a canvas covering on it. And it was pretty durable, and it surprisingly was pretty loud. So I grew up listening to a lot of 60s music, but I also listened to a lot of big band music and jazz and what my dad would call boogie woogie, which was early sort of piano blues. But that was coming from my dad. So this is definitely an older sister type thing, and I was hooked right off the bat. So you fast forward to retirement, which a word I don't like to use, but I call it third act. A friend of mine named Johnny, brought me a laundry basket full of 45s. What happened is they were at a record store, and the guy said, yeah, I'll give you that whole basket for $10. So he called me and he said, do you want it? Hey, DB, do you want it? I said, yeah, I'll take it. So I went through that basket one by one and examined every 45 in it, front and back. I even cleaned every 45. I found out on YouTube how to clean and how to get the right solution and how to get the dust and the lint off. And then I played all of them. And while I did that, I was in a record store, and a guy told me, he said, listen, you better go right from the beginning if you're collecting and enter your first record in Discogs. I go, what's that? He goes, it's an online database. Now, I'm not plugging them, but I'm just telling you, for me, it worked out really, really well, because as I looked up all these artists and these labels, I learned more and more about everything from the music itself down to where it was recorded. I learned about the artist, a lot of little tidbits there. I learned about, the licensing. I learned about where these things were pressed and manufactured. And it really tapped into my historian side. I've always loved history. I love Americana. And musical history was something I've always been fascinated in. And I always watch these documentaries or music documentaries or docudramas, whatever you call them, about musicians and music in the recording industry. So it was a perfect fit. And I'm not saying I don't golf, and I love the metal detect too, but this is just a great hobby for anybody, but specifically someone, in my age group, or, even younger, that just wants to have a little side hobby. You can buy, you can sell. In this case, I'm also finding and filming, and I'm on to that point now. So you can start anywhere at any time. You can have a huge collection. You can have a small one. You can collect one artist. You can collect one genre, or you can just be all over the map. It doesn't matter. It's all what you like. So if you like music and you love going down the history trail and you love dusty old 45s, stick around, because I think you're going to really like this. And so a couple things that I wanted to talk about today, a little bit more in depth, is how do I find these records and where do I find these records? Well, when you watch the RockMine, which is my weekly show on the same channel called the RockMine, I will actually take you into the different places where I find records. And sometimes it's an online thing where someone has a box of 45s that they're selling. Sometimes it's a thrift store. Sometimes it's basically a flea market. And what I find is 45s are often sort of shoved under the table. They don't get a lot of respect. And I'm going to try to change that too, because they really are a slice of musical history. Each one has a story to tell beyond just the song and the music itself. So I think if you start looking and you start getting into the groove and just jumping in and doing it, it really perpetuates itself. Now, you might say I'm obsessive. Okay, great. I've collected things my whole life. It probably started off with the little Disney figurines that you got from the Jell-O coupons, from the Jell-O packages that you mailed in. And when I was 3, my mom used to mail in the box tops from the Jell-O packages, and I collected the little Disney figurines. When I was about 8 or 9, it moved on to stamps and coins, and I collected stamps and coins. It's sort of like the coin, right? It's got 2 sides. That's what I like about singles. From there, it went on to I collected old bottles, and I used to go in the rivers and the lakes up in northern Michigan in the summertime. My dad was a teacher, so we had the whole summer off to just explore and And I found old cans, old bottles. I found old beer cans. But the blue bottles, the ones that had a blue color, the antique lady would come by once or twice a month. And she used to tell us, hey, you kids, if you find these old bottles, I'll pay you 25 cents a piece for them. And so we were finding any blue bottles. And she said, if the glass has bubbles in it, that's what I'm looking for. So sure enough, we learned how to find the valuable ones, and we sold them to her. And we made 25 cents, which was a lot of money back then. So going on that same line, I sort of started to really listen to music more. When we were in northern Michigan, my dad at the time was sort of ahead of his time. He wanted to get off the grid. We didn't call it that back then. But we didn't have any television, and we didn't have a telephone. We had one bathroom and basically a modified A-frame with a loft in the middle of 80 wooded acres. We did have a radio. So you have to understand, back then there was radio, and FM really hadn't come out yet. So it was what we call AM radio, still around today. And depending on what area you were in, it really depended on what kind of music you were going to get. Fortunately, growing up in Detroit, I had what I consider the best music in the world. We had Motown, we had rock and roll, we had funk. And there was jazz out there. There was late night talk. There was morning drive. We had great DJs, Arthur Penhall, Howard Stern was there for a cup of coffee, Steve Dahl, Gary Meyer. I don't know, no, Gary Meyer was a Chicago guy, but Steve Dahl was definitely there for a while. J.P. McCarthy, he was a great morning show guy. That was my mom's guy that she always listened to. We had great radio stations too. So we had CKLW, WDRQ, W4, WRIF, and ultimately, what I call the hippie sort of anti-establishment station was WABX. And I believe their logo was a pig. But that's right when FM started coming in. It was really a raw, unscripted format, just sort of like what I'm doing here. DJs would talk, and they would play stuff, and they would talk, and they really didn't seem to have any type of a format, which was awesome. And as rock and roll radio developed into what are they call? I think they called it AOR, album-oriented rock. As time went on, it became more structured and more developed. But that was a fun ride to be there from basically 66 to 81, listening to the transformation from tiny little FM or AM transistor radios that you would sneak under your pillow at night and fall asleep to, until full-blown floor to cabinet height stereo speakers and car audio with subwoofers and the emergence of rap and hip hop, So I got to see that whole span of music, AM pop to, rock and roll and everything in between. I would say Detroit radio was really diversified. So you would hear a rock song, what we would call a punk song, MC5. You would hear sort of a pop rock song, and then you would hear Stevie Wonder, Temptations, Four Tops, all mixed in on the same station. Brothers Johnson, then Devo. Even the new wave did break in, not quite as early and as strong as it did over in the UK. But we were hearing, Gary Newman, and we were hearing Nick Lowe, and the Clash broke through when we were starting to hear about bands like Elvis Costello, and we were interested in it. They didn't get a lot of heavy play, but our British Invasion was just there since day one. The Beatles, the Stones, the Who, all the great bands of the British Invasion, the Animals, right on down the line. That was local fare. So it was really a great time to be around listening to the radio. But at some point, you wanted to find the songs that you heard on the radio on a record so you could play them when you wanted, where you wanted, and as many times as you wanted. And that's where you went to the record store, or even in those days, sometimes the grocery store would have a record bin, if you can imagine that. So like I said, we were up in northern Michigan. We didn't have very many amenities. So once a week, my mom and I would go to the laundromat. And this was a long 2 or 3 hour, sometimes 4 hour chore. And I would help my mom unload the laundry and, move the laundry from the washer to the dryer and fold and reload the laundry in the car. But in between, when we were waiting, I would say, Mom, can I go next door to the grocery store? If I was lucky, I had a quarter, which I usually didn't, because if I had a quarter, I could buy a comic book. But if I didn't have any money, which was 9 times out of 10, I at least got to flip through the album bin. And I remember it as clear as day. It was A to Z. And you would start at A and start flipping through the albums. Every once in a while, you would find an album and you would recognize the name of the band. And if you flipped it over, you would find the song that you heard on the radio. So I literally went through A to Z, and sometimes my mom would come get me, and it would be at P, and I would remember next week I'll pick up at P. And I would follow P all the way around to Z and start all over again. And I noticed, wow, every Tuesday or 2 or 3 times a month, new stuff would come in. So I would start over. And I never had any money to buy them, but I just looked at them. The artwork on LPs was incredible. And some of it was shocking. Some of it was just very creative and colorful, psychedelic, bold, bright colors. Guys that had long hair, guys that looked like they were having a lot of fun, girls that were beautiful. Everybody in the youth-oriented record market, which 99% of it was at that time, looked like they were having tons of fun. And I was sort of bored. So of course I was attracted to it. And of course we'd go over the magazine rack, and there was magazines about rock and roll and stuff like that. So I would flip through those. I never could afford to buy them. And once in a while I'd get kicked out of the magazine section for loitering. And then my dad said, well, just tell them that you're browsing. So I would say, I'm just browsing. I was 9, I was telling the owners that I was just browsing. So that's how it got started for me. And I think a lot of people, a lot of you guys out there are probably thinking, yeah, I remember those days. I remember those days, We had radio and we had records. And maybe your record player wasn't that great, but your dad's might be. And I would say 90% of American households had a record player. And they all had the small spindle, but they also had a little device that either popped up or you inserted to play the 45. Now, the nice thing about the 45, if I remember, an album would cost anywhere between $3 and $6. $3 would be really, really a good price. I remember $4. $6 might be even get you a double album. But you could get this at some places for 98 cents. And I remember when it went up to $1.29, I just about died. So if you really wanted a record and you needed to have Big Brother and the Holding Company down on me, you could get it. And the bonus is you got another song on the other side. So I met a millennial not too long ago that they wanted to know how you played the other side. Well, you flipped it over. It's not like a CD. So there's 2 sides to every 45. So you always got a bonus song. Now, if you were really lucky, the other side would be a hit too. We called that a twofer, or a double A side. So, and then you would just play it over and over and over and over and over obsessively. You drive your parents nuts. But that's the history of rock and roll. And they started pressing these things about 1949, 1950. And it was a sort of a format war. So I can't remember the two companies, but I'm pretty sure one of them was RCA, and the other one may have been Universal, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But the 45, although it only contained one song and one on the flip side, you could buy an album of 45s. Let's remember, an album is just a collection of songs or pictures. So you can have a picture album, you could have an album, a scrap album, but a collection of songs could be 10 of these in a box. And you could buy an album of 45s. It would be 5 records, and you would stack them on the automatic turntable. It would drop one into place, play to the side, and automatically drop the second, third, fourth, and fifth. When you were done, you took the whole stack, you flipped them over. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You listened to 10 songs, essentially an album. Interesting format. But how about if you could just put all 10 songs on one record? Well, they figured that out too. And that was played at 33 1/3, so they slowed down the rotation a little bit so they could get more information on one record. So there you played your 5 songs, you flipped the one record over, and you played your second 5 songs. Either way, it's an album. There's a lot of technical differences between different recordings. In the old days, these were recorded directly on wax, and then the wax would be cut, and then that wax would be turned into pressing or mastering plates, and then gross or mass produced into records. So as time went on, the recording process got more sophisticated too, where they started to use tape and then make a master from the tape. But around World War II, they were starting to use tape. And when you use tape, you can stop tape, you can edit tape. So the recording itself became more sophisticated. Before that time, it was one live cut. And if you screwed up, you had to start all over and do it all over again, which was expensive and it took a lot of time. And there's some nuances too. The grooves and the speed of the record is different on 45s. And some people claim it's better. A lot of these were meant to be played on the radio, because soon enough, with 45 RPM records, record companies realized, oh, we can give these out free to the DJs, and we can get them to play them on this thing called the radio, which was exploding. So you had AM radio well established since the 1930s all over the United States, but now you had this new format called FM radio. And the idea was to get your quote-unquote single, which is a 45, into as many DJs' hands as you possibly can. And you get that DJ to play it as many times as he possibly will. And there was probably some nefarious stuff going on there where certain DJs were maybe getting incentivized to play it more often. Now, that's a whole other issue, but it did happen. You can look it up. There was things they called the payola scandal. It's no secret. But for the most part, if you had a song that was good and it jumped out of the radio and it sounded good and teenagers liked it, you were on the right track. Just ask bands like the Beach Boys or the Turtles, or let's go over to the British Invasion with the Beatles. So they had that sound, and when they recorded these 45s, the grooves are a little wider and a little deeper. So what I've been told, and my understanding, is the sound tends to be more hi-fi. It tends to be mixed a little higher, And because of the actual structure, depth, and width of the grooves, it was actually able to produce a more high fidelity sound, a true sounding higher fidelity than the traditional 33 and a third RPM format. Now you'll find audiophiles or audio snobs that'll disagree with me, but I have listened to albums in 45s side by side, the same song, and I found that to be true for the most part. That's not saying that individual companies may or may not make a better or brighter sounding record or more hi-fi record. And what is hi-fi? Well, let's talk about what is stereo. So stereo was huge, and I was around for the introduction of stereo. So stereo, you're listening to two independent recording tracks at the same time. So what it does to the human brain is create depth. Because if you can hear something over here and something else over here, it mimics what happens to us in nature, like walking through the forest. You might hear a bird over here and a stick crack to the left of you. And you sort of get that immersion effect. And needles originally, that used to go up and down, and that was a mono sound. But someone figured out, what if we made the needle go up and down as it travels through these grooves, and also go left and right? I might have them mixed up, but when you go up and down, or one dimension, that's mono, and you only need one speaker. There are people that claim that mono is more of a true sound. That stereo, the minute you break it up into two separate sounds, you're altering a basic or fundamental sound to such a degree that you're creating something artificial. I love them both. And I think with stereo, you can really, really do some cool stuff. And if you didn't have the equipment, the good news was, whether this was a stereo or mono release, it would play on either a stereo system, which had the two speakers, or a mono system. So when they made the shift from mono to stereo, which is more late 50s, 59, it didn't matter if you had a stereo yet, because stereo or mono records would still play on the old mono equipment. So that's that. I mean, this is a little bit longer format, so feel free to get up, get a cup of coffee, and dig in. And the whole goal is to have you enjoy this so much that you might even want to take a nap and still hear me talking. But it's good information, and you sort of need to know the background of what you're getting into before you jump into a hobby like this. It just makes it more interesting and more fun. All right, so when we get into the stereo mono debate, if you will, the stereo, like I said before, allows you to do more things. And it allows you to throw some instrumentation over on the right and some on the left. And you can do that in the recording studio. So you can create an effect that there is literally things traveling from this side of the room over to the other. And if anybody doubts that, listening to Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, when you hear the helicopter go across from the left to the right speaker or vice versa, it's really, really a cool effect. Led Zeppelin, Ramble On, there's a doo-doo, da-na, 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 da-na. That's a very deliberate, distinct manipulation using stereo that really blows a lot of people away. So as the records became more sophisticated, the equipment that you played it on became more sophisticated. So we start off with AM radio, We go to FM radio, which, by the way, for the most part, was broadcast in stereo. And then we go from hi-fi records to stereo recordings. So about 1972, I think it was around then that my dad came home from Sears, or maybe it was Christmas time and he got a bonus. And he had what we called a stereo system. And in this particular setup, you had your receiver and amplifier all in one unit. And it had two separate speakers that were connected by wires, left and right channel. I was so excited that I almost peed my pants. And I was like 9, you know what I mean? But this particular unit had something else which was new that year, called a cassette player recorder. And it was built into the stereo receiver. And it was such a thing that you would put the cassette tape in, which I'll explain in a minute. You would depress it and it would click into place. Now, what good is that? Because I didn't have a cassette tape, number one. And if I did, it would probably be blank with no music. So this was so new that I don't even know if you could buy pre-recorded music on cassettes at the stores. You probably could, but it wasn't something that was in our house. But what you could do, and my older sister taught me this, is you could record songs off the radio. And forget the legalities of it. I'm 9 at this point. So I found an old cassette tape that my sister had. I think it was one of her boyfriends had basically given her an audio love letter type thing. I think he was like stationed overseas. So it was this long, rambling cassette tape of him just dictating his love note. And I learned that you could tape over. And it was just sitting there. And eventually I took it and I popped it into the stereo cassette recorder. And what you had to do was hit the play button and the record button at the exact same time. And I figured out if I sit here long enough and listen to the radio and wait for my favorite songs to come up, and I do that every time they come on, I'll fill up this whole tape full of great free music. So that's what I did. And before long, I had my first mixtape. And I didn't know what that was, but it was just a tape. Now, I didn't know about recording volume yet. There was a needle, but I didn't know what it was for. So I totally had the needle over in the red some songs, and I had it over on the left on other songs. But eventually my sister said, if you keep that needle up at the top in this little zone, she goes, it'll be just right. So I played the mixtape. I remember Stevie Wonder, You Are the Sunshine of My Wife, Lee Michaels, Do You Know What I Mean? Mama Don't Dance But Your Daddy Don't Rock and Roll. What was that? Loggins and Messina was on there. I had a lot of great songs on there. Those 3 pop off the top of my head. So what do you do with a mixtape? Well, I gave it to a girl. And so that was it, man. So I was hooked. So now you have the rudimentary beginnings of Detroit Bob and his fascination and obsession with music. And it continues to today. So back to the actual passion and the art of collecting. I think what we have now, what has happened, and this may explain some of the vinyl resurgence, is we've gone down the digital road so far that we've entered into what I call a digital dystopia. So we dumped all this music onto these computers, into these hard drives, but the problem is we're on our 10th computer, so the stuff we loved has been lost 10 hard drives ago. We don't know where it is. We don't know how to access it. And we've gotten away from where you just turn the radio knob on and listen to the music that's coming over the airwaves. We had someone serving us our food, but now we've gone to where everything is self-serve. And we might not even like the menu. And after a while, we've lost our appetite. Because when you had someone presenting the music to you, like a DJ, they were also telling you a little bit about the band, a little bit about the record, a little bit about the weather, and a little bit of motivation to get you up off your butt and get you out to the beach. And the greatest DJs in the world not only played records, but they got you moving and they got you dancing and they got you off your feet. When we were in the office or stuck behind the computer or listening to our MP3 players, it was just sort of a boring, lonely, robotic experience. Okay. And then what happened? Well, vinyl's having a resurgence right now. I think you pull the rubber band back so far, and at one point it either snaps or you let go and it goes the other way. So I've heard people talk about the fact that it's tangible, and I love that too, because I can play this record right now and I can play it in 50 years. If I have it in my hand, I can look at it, I can taste it, I can smell it. It's all right there. And if I save it on a shelf, it'll always be there and I know how to find it. It's labeled. I don't have to label it. I don't have to type into a computer and create a file. This is a file. It's already created. So there's something very tangible. The color, the artwork, and the organization system is sort of already built in. And the format, the size, the file size, they're made out of plastic, styrene or plastic. So getting back to why vinyl. So people wanted something tangible. I think that has a lot to do with it. There's some romance to it. There's a lot of nostalgia, and this is not going to be a nostalgia show. Because half the stuff that I find, I've never heard before. I'm not stuck on playing oldies. And RockMine is not an oldies channel. You might find some stuff, some ethereal music on there, or something that I would do yoga to. So it's not going to be a walk down memory lane. It's going to be discovering new stuff. And you may discover something about yourself too by watching these weekly episodes. Like I said in episode 1, we're always looking for something. And I've been looking for coins and stamps and jars and bottles and beer cans and posters my whole life. And I'm looking for vinyl now, but what are we ultimately looking for? Answers. Who are we and what are we here for? So the vinyl journey that you will follow Detroit Bob on will hopefully get you up off the couch and get you moving, number one, and get your mind moving. And you will see some transformation maybe in the way you think and in the way you feel, just like I have with this little exercise. So next subject, we'll talk about literally where we find this stuff. Let me get a sip of coffee. All right, where am I at right now? I'm in the middle. This is the first time I've ever done this. I'm in the middle of what they call a podcast room in a coffee shop. So this apparently is a thing now. So I booked this room, and I'm going to do these long-form episodes about every 3 weeks. Detroit Bob will be here probably the second or third Tuesday or Thursday of the month, but I'll get a more formal schedule. And these are the ones that you put on if you just want to chill and listen. And like I said, you want to kick back, There's not going to be a beginning and a middle and an end to that, but I think you'll enjoy it just the same. And like if you doze off and take a nap, I don't care. If I helped you relax, I'm sort of happy about that. A little bit of more background on me. When it came to being able to speak and talk, that was never a problem. I was raised in a household where I had 3 very vocal sisters and a very, I would say, dominant mom. She was very vocal and social. So there was always a lot of talking and always a lot of drama. And so I could look at my mom's face and tell what kind of mood she's in since I was about 3. So I learned to read people, and then I learned to speak up. My dad was quieter, but he was the artistic side. So he would teach me how to see things in an artistic and a visual way that I didn't realize at the time, but other kids weren't learning that. And since he was an art teacher who was always teaching me visual ways to present something or to show something or to look at something. And so eventually the vocal and the visual sort of combined, and I started doing not only recordings, but I started collecting music, making recordings for other people and girls on tape. And I remember for the first time being asked to audition for a part in a play. And I was probably about in 7th grade, and the role of Tiny Tim, if you remember Scrooge, came up. And I auditioned alongside probably the most popular kid in school and the star football player. And the 117-pound young Detroit Bob won the role. And I'm like, wow, okay, I must have passed the audition. I must have done pretty good. So the next year in 8th grade, they asked me to be the MC of the talent show. And at that time, I said, what do I have to do? They said, you just present the acts. And I was just going into becoming a DJ in my head and queuing up the next song. And I sort of did it innately, and it was a hit. The only part that went bad is when I told the nun joke. And that was, fortunately, that was during the rehearsals, and I was at a Catholic school, and it didn't go over too well. So they said, hey, Bobby, they called me back then, you might want to not do that joke. So fortunately, we had a rehearsal in there, and I didn't do it the next night. But it was a hit. First bands, I performed in that show, and so the first band was, we called it K&K Chopsticks. My best buddy Kev and I sat down and we worked out an arrangement of an old, probably turn of the century little like vaudeville type song on the piano. I think it's called Salt and Pepper, but I'm not sure. So we did that. That was a hit. And I was like, I was very comfortable with that. I think I did some stuff in the fashion show, got roped into that. And then in high school, I had no problem getting up in front of a crowd and speaking. So once in a while, that was my job. I was the mission rep, and I had to go collect money from kids. So speaking to strangers was no problem at all. And then we did radio and television, and I filmed my first commercial. I think I was 17, and I did a beer commercial. So I had made my dad buy me a beer, and it had to be non-alcoholic because I was bringing it in school. And I remember pouring it in a Pilsner glass and making sure that the bubbles came up and holding it up to the light so you could see the bubbles. That was my dad's visual coming out. And then I took the beer and I literally downed it. And very slowly and deliberately wiped my lips. And I said, now that is a good beer. The teacher loved it. I got an A. So whenever I needed good grades, I would do something where artistically or speaking. That was how I got my grade point up, and did well in art class. Got introduced to a lot of different art forms and a lot of different music, because I noticed that the kids that I was playing football with didn't listen to the same kind of music as the kids in my art class. Imagine that. The kids in my art class were a different breed, and a lot of them were from Detroit, and some of them had long hair, even though you weren't supposed to at the Catholic school. And then some of them smoked a couple packs of cigarettes a day at 15. And they had pretty sophisticated taste in music. And I remember a guy bringing in a copy of Devo's first album, and I didn't even know what it meant, let alone what it was, but it had the classic yellow Chichi Rodriguez cover, and thinking, that's interesting. And I heard their version of Satisfaction, which I knew that song because I heard that on the radio all the time. But I said, oh, that's very interesting what they did with that. So I learned what artistically you could do to that art form by changing it and making it your own. And whenever I had a project, I painted. I painted a picture of Pete Townsend, a picture of Jeff Beck. I think I made Ted Nugent out of a wire sculpture. I had another electric guitar player that I made out of pen and ink line drawing. So I was obsessed with music, it's fair to say, by 10th grade. It was one of the main driving forces in my life. But I still maintained, I was still playing football and running track and, doing that thing too. So that, long story short, I started looking at film in a different way. We had a how to look at film class in high school. And I remember seeing Cool Hand Luke. And then for the first time watching a movie, not as, a story, but watching a movie as to how it's made and what is the person who made the movie trying to say beyond the obvious. So the story within the story and the symbolism and the foreshadowing. And we actually, Requiem for a Heavyweight, Lifeboat. These were pretty sophisticated movies. And then, Lifeboat, I think it was an Alfred Hitchcock film. But I remember looking at that movie and thinking, wow, it's sort of stark and it's black and white and there was some moodiness to it. And then there was the dawn of the VCR. So I really got into filming. I rented every Hitchcock movie I could get my hands on. So Alfred Hitchcock visually to me was scary, but it was like, ooh, don't look at that, but look at that, like our deepest, darkest fears, So there was a scary part to it. I remember watching Birds and the guy was getting ready to light the cigarette, and you've seen it before, and then you don't drop the lighter, don't drop the match, as you see the gasoline, it's creeping over near his feet. So it wasn't all Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, although even with that was probably the first movie that people in my generation saw over and over and over again. And I remember Dorothy singing, Somewhere Over the Rainbow, and I thought, oh, she's sad. I remember as a very young kid, that's a sad song. And I remember thinking, I feel like that sometimes too. Is that normal? But she was searching for something too. So back to that theme, we're all searching for something. So vinyl, if it gets you up off the couch and gets you living and moving and dancing and enjoying life and maybe streaming and launches you into something else, I like it for that. And I think that's part of the goal. I brought a couple props. I told you about the laundry bin. I do a lot of reading on rock and roll. This was a good one I read recently, Detroit Rock City. It was by Steve Miller. I think it sort of walks you through the whole Detroit scene. It's all basically cut and paste interview type format. It takes you from Iggy and the MC5 all the way to Jack White and the White Stripes. So the middle section was a little dry, but I thought it was a good book. So I could talk about that all day. This is not going to be about me. It's going to be about you. It's going to be about the music. But I just wanted to give you some background on myself. I had a great day in Chicago yesterday. Went to a place called Beverly Records. I found some cool stuff there. Hyde Park Records. What a cool little record shop that was. And the proprietor spoke French. And it was a very diverse neighborhood. And everybody in that record store was really chilling. Just some good music. And it was quite a scene. I liked it. And then Sugar was more on the north side of Chicago. We went in there. Very cool. Great. Guy was very helpful. I found some good vinyl there. And even today, I went to this place in Valparaiso, Indiana called Revolution. So she had some good vinyl in there too. So I'll help promote local record stores. So if you want to chime in and subscribe with my YouTube channel, and that's the thing with YouTube, they want you to subscribe. So you're not going to get any pop-ups, but just if you click on the subscribe button, it helps me get it out to more people. This is going to be a low-budget production, but I am looking for sponsors for anything from clothing down to, I got to have my Detroit stuff on and my glasses. If you guys want to jump in on that, just contact me. We'll work out a deal. But I think I'm going to call it an episode. I think it's been great talking to you. I hope the audio is clear. Sorry for the hiccups here and there and the gaffes, but I think we did pretty good on this. Make sure you tune in every Friday at noon for RockMine. We got some great episodes coming up. We're going to do thrifting. We got France. We got New Orleans. We've got Arizona. So wherever I go in the world, you're going to follow me. So ultimately, we're looking for Vee-Jay Records, Veejay, number 498. Please Please Me, backed with Ask Me Why. It was the original Beatles album. Take that back. The original Beatles single, 45, just like this, that Capitol Records passed on, and little old Vee-Jay Records, originally out of Gary, Indiana, and then Chicago, Illinois, picked up and for 6 months had the rights to. The problem is Dick Biondi played it a couple times on WLS, and it was not a hit. Beatlemania hadn't hit. British Invasion hadn't hit. So it only sold about 5,000 copies. So it's very rare. And I don't know why, but I love that story so much that I just have to have one. So that is Detroit Bob's holy grail. And I'm constantly searching for it. So I'm going to find it. And yeah, I'm a little bit obsessive, but I am going to find that. So you'll follow me along. But every week we'll have a gem of the week. So as I find stuff, I'm going to summarize it. I'm going to tell you how much I paid for everything and how much it's worth on Discogs. And then I'm going to take you on the journey through my wins and my losses. And I think overall you'll really enjoy it. I don't think there's anything else like it on the internet. So Detroit Bob sounding off, saying goodbye. We will see you in about 3 weeks for this long form, which we call Detroit Bob, the podcast, or Detroit Bob's podcast. We'll figure that out. The regular weekly show is called RockMine, hosted by Detroit Bob. And you'll see a lot of these shorts pop up, about one a day. Just a little blurb about what that week's RockMine's about. So the channel's called RockMine on YouTube. Subscribe, enjoy, and share if you like it. We'll see you next time. This is Detroit Bob signing off.